When I originally made my orders of videos to work on, I listed this one down as it's an important part of basketball history, regardless of what some arrogant people may think. I originally was going to do this video after my New York Rens video to match the tone when expressing the progression over the years. But then, I realized after the Yabusele video that the WNBA ends on September 19th, so what better time to dive into the history and rich story of women's basketball. While many may think of the men's group exclusively when discussing the greats of sports, there are some legends that often don't get their rightful praise. So without further ado, let's dive in to the journey of women's basketball over the years. While Naismith's game of basketball started in 1891, women would be introduced to the game a year later in 1892. When the rules of Naismith's game were officially published around the world, they were available for people to read and expand the game. One such person was Senda Berenson Abbott. She became the James Naismith for the female game, introducing it to her own college and starting a new branch of the sport for women. Along with Naismith's rules, she also added additional rules to make the game less rough and physical for the women in order to play. The game was also organized very, very differently. It was a game of decorum, modesty, and properness. As the cool kids say nowadays, very demure, very mindful. It was more of a song and dance to prevent the roughness and chaos that was perceived in the men's game. Women were perceived as frailer and more likely to become injured, and it was unladylike to perform more of these aggressive forms of physical activity. This perception of women needing to be gentle was not just pushed by the macho men of the era, though. It was actually the thought of both genders everywhere, before sports and other things started to push the boundaries. In the WNBA's biography of the game, they state themselves that if women had suggested that they could play a men's game like a man, it would have outraged men and women alike. Berenson hoped to prevent a young lady from developing dangerous nervous tendencies and losing the grace and dignity and self-respect we would all have her foster. Rather than a 5v5 game, the team was split up into 6 players. This was done to give the teams an even number as the court was split into thirds. Each section had 2 players, 2 guards, 2 forwards, 2 centers in their respective sections, and each player could not move into the other section. So in order to move the ball up and down the court, each section would have a bit of one-on-one while passing it to the other section. The ball could not be stolen from other players, again to keep the calm and properness, and also you could not hold the ball for more than 3 seconds or dribble it more than 3 times. However, many women still pushed to play by the men's rules once they were published, as said before. There was just one small problem among many of the other political problems that prevented women to play by similar rules, and it's one that you may not expect right away. Clothing. Back when the game was in its early days, women still wore very conservative and restrictive clothing. As you can imagine, it's much more difficult to play basketball when you're wearing dresses and corsets. Luckily, this is where Clary Gregory Bear comes in. Clara was another female Naismith in a way, being the first to publish the women's basketball rules just as Naismith had for the men, originally calling it basket. However, that name only lasted until 1908. Arguably as important, she helped campaign for an article of clothing others had written off or condemned. Bloomers. Bloomers were less constricting and shorter like shorts and ruffles. They were originally condemned in the 1850s and beyond because of how revealing they were, but Clara and the Women's Congress of the World's Columbian Exposition helped push for their usage again in 1893 because of how much they promoted physical activity, health, and overall fitness and exercise. Many other efforts were made to make the bloomer commonplace, like Annie Londonderry wearing it on her bicycle expedition. But with these bloomers, women could do a lot more than previously confined, especially when specific athletic bloomers were made and popularized closer to 1900s to 1910s, closer to what we think of as shorts today. Clara Bear was an absolute icon. She also came up with what some believe were the first rules of what would become a precursor to volleyball, while William G. Morgan is instead credited to have invented volleyball. Unfortunately, things like this, where women are erased from history, would become commonplace. Hence is the purpose of this video, to revive some of that history. However, it isn't all bad, and much like all things, there are two sides, as many men also assisted women in their efforts, with the WNBA official website writing that Dr. Edward Morton Schaefer in 1896 helped influence the use of shorts and bloomers and insulting the corset clothing. WNBA puts, he wrote a ringing diatribe against the corset, calling it a figure and health-wrecking contrivance. He urged active modern women to burst all confining fetters and curtail necessary impediments of costume, and to adopt a divided skirt to ease our locomotion when exercising. In another example of many outside world things affecting sports and vice versa, there was a large argument around this time for women to earn more for their jobs. However, the biggest argument against this was that women took more sick days and were not at their professions as often, and therefore were paid less salary for being out more. This led Bear, Berenson, and many others to try and encourage sports further, as more exercise and physical activity would lead to better overall health, therefore less sick days and more equality overall. The first demonstration game of this women's basketball was held on March 13, 1895. To quote the NCAA, the demonstration was before an all-female audience of 560 at the Southern Athletic Club, the first publicly played basketball game in the South by men or women. The NCAA goes on to describe the rules of the first demonstrational game, which stick out as very, very different from what we think today, just like said before. Bear's rules, much different than Berenson's, divide the court according to the number of players on a side. 11 sections if 11 players, 7 sections if 7 players. No dribbling or guarding is allowed. A player is given 6 seconds to aim and shoot the ball. No backboards are allowed. Players may run only when the ball is in the air and then a few steps within their area. Goals are changed after each score so that offensive and defensive roles are reversed. The one-handed push shot is required. Traditionally, women's values still take hold, as the two-shot was also considered a foul, as a forward inclination of the shoulders resulted in, quote, consequent flattening of the chest, which would have been seen as unladylike or improper. Like many others, this rule was to ensure that players maintained a more upright and proper posture while playing. However, with this version of the rules being so different from the men's, it led to constant revisions, adjustments, and taking inspiration from the original game. It wasn't long before there were several different versions floating across the country, and several women in charge had to come together and establish some official rules and regulations. The WNBA states, by 1893, the women of Mount Holyoke and Sophie Newcomb were playing too. By 1895, the game was played all across the country, most prominently at Wellesley, Vassar, and Bryn Mawr. The rules depended on where it was played, and committees met endlessly to discuss regulations. Even before 1900, boundaries and expectations were being broken as women started to break the quote-unquote proper and ladylike expectations and play more agile, fast-paced, and physical to match their male counterparts. As you would expect, many spoke out against this. Seeing this activity from women was like seeing Bigfoot for people before 1900. It didn't help that clothing still had a ways to go, as mentioned earlier, and all the movement caused hairpins, headbands, and other accessories to go flying and littered across the gym floor, leaving piles of debris. Once again, the WNBA continues saying, Games would end with handkerchiefs and hairpins scattered all over the gymnasium floors. It befuddled some of the lovable rockheads who were writing about it. One article in the Los Angeles Times had a headline that said, "Sweet things have gone scrap." It went on to furnish details of the high school game that included a lot of hair pulling, tumbling, and sliding. The reporter wrote there was something disquieting in the grim and murderous determinations with which the young ladies chased each other around all over the court. A physical education teacher named Agnes Childs complained of these tendencies in 1905 in a Spalding Guide to Women's Basketball. There is an irresistible temptation when a ball is rolling across the floor for the players in the vicinity to go sliding after it, and nothing makes a game more rowdy in appearance and causes more adverse criticism than this most natural temptations to go after the ball by the quickest means. About a year later, on April 4th, 1896, the first intercollegiate game on the West Coast played between Stanford and University of California, Berkeley happened. From there, the game only became more and more popular, popping up in Washington State April 17th, Chicago later that year, and then Nebraska. Going into 1897, it traveled to California, Wisconsin, then Maine. In 1898, it continued with Women's Hoop's website laying out the timeline as the following. Most importantly, in this year, Iowa would be introduced to the game, which would become very relevant later.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
However, still the game had too much confusion and differing versions to be coherent. So in 1899, before the turn of the 20th century, women met in Springfield, Massachusetts, the birthplace of men's basketball and the location that would become the Basketball Hall of Fame, to form the Women's Basketball Rules Committee at the Conference of Physical Training. The goal was to make the rules uniform and address concerns that the game was getting too rough. Before 1900, the game saw many more ups and downs. Oregon introduced the game as a varsity sport 2 years before the men's team. The University of Tennessee also introduced the game into their physical education curriculum. However, Stanford and Cali forbid the game from being played at an intercollegiate level, while still being played at an amateur and intramural level. Entering the first year of the 20th century, the game was really taking off. It helped that the game was finally getting some positive press for once, with one newspaper writing, "It is the only exercise that has thus far been found that most girls can indulge in." But still, the question of rules remained. In 1901, Luther Gulick pulled together a group of women consisting of the ones at the 1899 meeting for another standardization of rules. The group tried to incorporate all different rule sets, but the main priority was the health and safety of the women playing, as well as feminine values once again. As Agnes Wayman imposed, neatly combed hair, no gum chewing or slaying, never calling each other by last names, and never lying or sitting on the floor. Due to this, the group decided to keep Berenson's 3 sections court style. The official rules were published by A.G. Spalding himself, the same man Naismith himself sought out to make an official ball, making him help the women's efforts. Berenson was the main editor, allowing her to command a position of respect in the basketball community against remaining ignorance, and the book was placed in Spalding's athletic library. But even with that publication, others still refused to listen to those rules, as you may have guessed, since women's basketball is not played this way. Words Press puts it, as late as 1914, 1/2 to 2/3 of women were playing by men's rules, while the others were playing by at least 5 different versions of the women's rules. The game kept spreading to what would eventually become UConn and high schools across the country. As the years went on, the game inherited more rules from the men's side, like the out-of-bounds rule. There was still a struggle, such as when women at Kansas State asked to play on the court and were refused. But the fight continued, with 8 high schools, private schools, and colleges organizing to form the Girls Basketball League of Southern California, the first on the West Coast. In 1903, more games were being reported in the paper, and in 1905, the National Women's Committee becomes part of the American Physical Education Association, known today as the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. Things kept going consistent over the next few years with pushback and advances, such as the Amateur Athletic Union headed by James Sullivan, which governs sports activities outside of high schools or colleges, declaring that it will not permit girls to participate in basketball games in public places. This was all until a massive world event happened: World War I. I've discussed many times how this event affected practically everything, which is expected given the scale. It isn't exactly called a world war for nothing. It influenced mascots and advertising, as well as other areas of sports as well, most notably the Olympics. Previously, I've already touched on how men were affected in the Olympics, but this was an even more pivotal point for women. For decades by this point, they had been fighting the expectation, dismantling norms and ladylike procedures. But with the start of 1914, men were shipped off to war, and yet again, women were expected more in the house to keep up the domestic efforts. This nearly stopped all momentum of political movements, including sports. However, with men off to war, it gave women the opportunity to work as nurses, factory workers, and other jobs that were now vacant to show that they were capable of more. But sports and activism weren't as much of a priority. The war was. In 1914, the American Olympic Committee formally opposed women's athletic competition in the Olympics. The fight continued with Dr. Mary Douglas Aries Ewell stating that women wanted equal rights and privileges as men, such as paid travel, funding, and more, a battle that is still being fought over a century later with the WNBA. Entering the 1920s is when a lot of things would change or start happening. In 1920, the game really exploded, for one sole purpose, the thing that has always ruled the world: money. Industrial women's leagues started to pop up left and right. Companies believed that if they sponsored a winning women's team, it was good publicity, and it was. In Texas alone in 1920, Industrial League's women's basketball was so large that over 1,000 women were applying to play in AAU-sanctioned tournaments. Companies were even recruiting or hiring women to play for them the same way college scholarships do today. And according to Women's Hoops, in 1922, the National Amateur and Athletic Foundation is founded, committed to boys and girls being on an equal footing with the same standards, the same programs, and same regulations. However, it still wouldn't be all sunshine and rainbows. The women's game would still be opposed widely, even on a presidential level. Propaganda was even pushed, such as this, showing the women as being violent and stepping on each other, like Draymond Green did to Sabonis. Lou Henry Hoover, head of Girl Scouts of America and wife of President Herbert Hoover, would help the women's division of Nationally Amateur Athletic Foundation. This attacked competitive athletics, especially basketball, as being unhealthy and inappropriate. Concerns that women's scholastic athletics will begin to resemble men's as being quasi-professional, corrupt, and promoting gambling. They promoted a sports for sports' sake philosophy. It seemed that even between the world wars, the aim was to paint sports as the enemy to focus on what was quote-unquote more important. But that didn't stop anyone. And in 1924, women's basketball was an expedition sport at the Olympics. Later that year, International Women's Sports Federation is formed, and it hosts its version of the Olympics. Women's basketball was included in the competition, and the AAU held its first national basketball tournament for women's with 6 teams. All major accomplishments and steps forward. One team especially was on the rise: Iowa. The first Iowa high school statewide basketball tournament was held, and 250 teams participated. By the 1950s, this high school tournament would have an attendance of 15,000 fans. Once again,
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
the propaganda that was being pushed was combated with pictures like this, appearing in magazines and newspapers nationwide to show what they were capable of. Skipping through the rest of the 20s, the WNBA was very flip-floppy. Once again, they realized that sports also meant money. And so, the WNBA convention in New York City focused their attention on businesses, chamber of commerce, and church groups who looked to improve their public image through successful basketball teams. However, a few years later, in 1927, the organization, quote, pressured officials in Wichita, Kansas, a hotbed of industrial basketball, to cancel the AAU National Women's Basketball Tournament, prompting some business owners to demand teams. So on one hand, they were promoting basketball, and on the other hand, they were destroying it. This pressure continued entering the 1930s, where not only women's basketball, but basketball as a whole almost was completely erased for good from the WNBA due to the organization, quote, competitive basketball at elementary, high school, and college levels all but disappeared. Despite this, games were still being played and tournaments were still held. However, women still struggled to balance between being feminine and being athletic. This came to a climax in 1939 when the All-American Redheads were formed, a team that deserves a whole video on its own. Playing by only the men's rules and either wearing wigs or dyeing all of their hair red in order to still portray their femininity with their sporting skill. The team was graced across magazines, television, and even other outlets, being nationwide sensations, and advancing the movement a massive amount. But where there's ups, there's downs, with Missouri voting to ban women's tournaments play, and later in 1939, a survey shows that 25% of black colleges object to women participating in intercollegiate sports, while 83% of white colleges were against women participating in varsity athletics. On top of that, another war had begun, resulting in the same setbacks as described before. This setback would continue until after the war had concluded and companies once again picked up the backbone, with in 1945, according to World Press, close to 10,000 companies sponsored sports organizations for their workers, looking to fill extra hours and now reduced work week. Basketball teams include Haynes Hosiery, Cook's Goldblum, Dr. Pepper in Arkansas, and the Atlanta Blues, an independent team. They scheduled games against each other during a regular season on weekends, culminating in the AAU National Tournament. Entering the 1950s, the fight for women's rights and desegregation started to blend, with more African American women's teams appearing and being advocated. Also in 1954, the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union is formed under the direction of Wayne Cooley, which successfully worked to establish a statewide program for girls' sports equal to that for boys. In 1974, almost 500 Iowa schools have full girls' programs, which included equal coaches' salaries, better media coverage, and an end-of-the-season championship for both boys and girls. Not much changed or happened until the late 1960s, when in 1968, women had basketball in the Paralympics, and in 1969, a woman was actually drafted to the NBA. She did not play for a team, but this was huge news, with Denise Long being selected at the 13th pick by the Warriors. In 1970, remember Iowa? They were an absolute icon. With the way they handled sports with both women and men, people flocked there in numbers. And in 1970 alone, 20% of all girls participating in high school sports across the country were in Iowa, despite making up only 1% of the population. In terms of women's sports, especially basketball, Iowa was king, much like today. A few years later, and that brings us to another major moment in the movement: Title IX. The Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women was hosting many women's tournaments and was starting to govern all of women's basketball. Once again, with money in the mind, the AAU National Convention realized that they were behind the times and that if they didn't incorporate women's basketball, someone else would have control. And therefore, the AAU incorporated women's basketball and passed a motion to start a national basketball tournament for girls 15 and under and 18 and under. Most importantly though, a massive piece of legislation was passed, with all the progress made and once again women's sports making it to the White House. The government started to reevaluate things. Much like in many times in history, they pondered and thought and considered what the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence said: all men are created equal, as well as the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, now being a century old, that no citizen can be deprived of rights and privileges. With all this, Nixon, on June 23, 1972, passed Title IX, and the law stated that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Meaning all boys' schools could not receive an unfair amount more than all girls' schools and things of that nature. But if sports were included in a school's funding and education, that meant that men's sports could also not receive more funding than a women's sports, causing a cascade effect. This opened Pandora's box in a good way, leading to more money floating to women's sports, allowing for far more opportunities. While previously Iowa was the center of women's sports and basketball opportunities, Title IX led women to spread out and play in states more local to them. The 20% dwindled down to only 5% in 1976. A few months later in 1973, the AIAW first offers college scholarships to female athletes, and the first AAU national tournament was held in New Orleans. 16 teams participated, followed by colleges offering more college scholarships in 1974. In 1975, the game had progressed so far that women's games were being shown more on TV, and they even had a game all the way in Madison Square Garden with an attendance of 11,969. In comparison, the New York Knicks themselves in this Madison Square Garden was about 16,408. College women's basketball was getting almost the same attendance as the New York Knicks in their home NBA stadium. 1976 was another massive year. Just 4 years after Title IX, Ann Myers became the first woman to receive a 4-year scholarship to UCLA. And with the help of television, Karen Logan, a member of the previously mentioned All-American Redhead team, defeated Jerry West in a game of horse on CBS. And in a huge landmark, women's basketball made its way to the Olympics, finally on the world stage among the men. 2 years later, in 1978, the WNBA would start to see its predecessors formed, with Women's Basketball League, WBL, formed by Bill Bryan. It featured 8 teams: the Chicago Hustle, the Dayton Rockets, Houston Angels, Iowa Cornets, Milwaukee Does, Minnesota Phillies, New Jersey Gems, and the New York Stars. They played a 34-game schedule the first year, and 6,000 fans in Houston watched the Angels defeat the Cornets for the first WBL championship. Despite the newly founded WBL, previously mentioned Ann Myers was drafted to the Indiana Pacers in the NBA before eventually being cut. In 1981, there was a bit of a scandal with AIAW and the NCAA. Again, like the AAU, the NCAA realized that it was behind and started offering women's tournaments as well, leading to a long and bloody legal battle. Well, we all know who won that, and the AIAW disbanded, and the NCAA took up their respective reigns instead. In 1984, the women won gold at the Olympics, and in 1985, women's basketball was honored at another historic level like the Olympics, with female Naismith Senda Berenson being inducted as the first woman to the Basketball Hall of Fame. The 80s continued on a steady uphill for a while for more Olympic golds, more tournament wins, and other milestones and rule changes. Into the 1990s is where things are really shown in full effect. The rewards and results of the long fight were on full display. Pat Summitt was the first woman to receive the John Bunn Award, the most prestigious honor given by the Basketball Hall of Fame. Benedict Maddox also became the first woman to coach a Division I men's team, serving as the assistant coach at University of Kentucky under Rick Pitino. Later, in March 28th, Oklahoma announced that it was going to cancel the women's program, but 9 days later, after a public outcry, the program was reinstated. This showed how much that people were willing to fight to have women's basketball versus being against it now. In 1993, Sheryl Swoopes signed a contract with Nike for a personalized sneaker. Just like MJ's Air Jordan, her Air Swoopes would sell for $115 a pair. And finally, in 1996, on April 24th, the WNBA was established. The teams were the Charlotte Sting, Cleveland Rockers, Houston Comets, Los Angeles Sparks, New York Liberty, Phoenix Mercury, Sacramento Monarchs, Utah Stars, and they would play a 28-game schedule. In 1997, Dee Kantner and Violet Palmer became the first female officials in the WNBA, and the women continued winning Olympic gold and their own personal battles for recognition, and finally brought us into the 2000s. Going into the 2000s, more things were showing progress. More signature shoes, more Olympic golds, more scholarships, and so on. In 2002, the McDonald's All-American was made for the women's team, finally after the men's all the way in 1977. The 2000s were also filled with some of the best women's players of all time. Diana Taurasi, Lisa Leslie, Tamika Catchings, Lauren Jackson, and of course, the amazing Sue Bird. The women continued to show that they could do what men can. In 2004, Candace Parker became the first woman to win a slam dunk contest of the McDonald's High School All-American game, beating out 5 male competitors. Unfortunately, the game still struggled to compete with the men's captive audience. The league was constantly at the end of jokes, the common punching bag, and the political climate only made it worse with pushing people away. But in recent years, women have come on another resurgence, with people such as Sabrina Ionescu and of course, Caitlin Clark. With Caitlin Clark, according to the network's parent company EW Scripps, it was reported that the number of men watching WNBA games on EON grew by 181% compared to last year in 2023, and the total viewers on EON for the WNBA attracted a total of 23.4 million viewers. Caitlin Clark was constantly selling out arenas, and it was a testament to her true power and excitement that she brought to the sport. She created a vibrant and fun game and was always breaking records and still is. Nowadays, you can almost see as many people wearing Caitlin Clark jerseys as other NBA players, and her impact is indescribable and deserves a whole video on its own. But entering the late 2020s with her at the helm, and the 2024 season coming to a close, we enter a new era of women's basketball. And my call to action to you is to watch a game. See what talent these women truly bring to the stage. It may just shock you and keep you entertained more than you know. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share the video around, all that good stuff. We're almost on 10K subscribers, so it really would help me and support me. And as always, I appreciate all the previous support that you guys have given me. Again, it really does help. And I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.